Hello the Year 11, this is Miss Potts and I'm here today to talk to you a little bit about what A-level history looks like. If you decide to take history at A-level in September, and we really hope that you do, you will have two history teachers. One of them will be from Mr. Richards, Miss Townsend or Mrs. Wood, and they'll teach you about the Tudors. But I belong to the Cold War in Asia team with Mr. Hardwell and Miss Harrison. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about not the Cold War in Asia, but the Cold War in Europe, because actually we think that if you're going to really understand this part of the course, there are a couple of things that you need to know about that are not part of our syllabus, but actually give you some really great contextual understanding of the world in 1945 and how that affects what's actually happening in Asia. So here we go, a little bit about the Cold War and the aftermath of the Second World War. So let's look at this quote here. When Germany is defeated, there will remain in the world only two great powers capable of confronting each other, the United States and Soviet Russia. The laws of history and geography will force these powers into a trial of strength, which may be military, economic, or ideological. A perfect prediction from Hitler. I don't have the date for this quotation, but I'm going to guess that it's at the very beginning of 1945 because of that really negative language from Hitler. Of course, he committed suicide on the 30th of April of 1945. But he says when Germany is defeated, so there's that defeatist language there. But what he predicts is the Cold War. He predicts that these two countries, the United States and Soviet Russia, will be these two great powers, and that they will be the only powers capable of confronting each other. And that actually the test that they're going to go into, this Cold War that they're about to embark on, will not just be a trial of military strength, but also economic strength and ideological strength. And the ideological bit at the end is really absolutely crucial for our understanding of what the Cold War actually was. So let's get into some definitions of the Cold War. There is this YouTube link here, which I suggest in a moment that you pause and you take a look at, so you're listening to someone other than me. John Green talks very fast, stereotypical American, but he does have some really interesting things to say about the Cold War. So in a moment you can pause this and go away and bring up that YouTube link. But essentially what the Cold War was this time of persistent hostility between 1945 and 1989, maybe even to 1991. 1989 is seen as the beginning of the end because that's when the Berlin Wall was taken down, and that was a great sign of the division between the East and West, which is essentially what the Cold War actually was. Here's our dictionary definition: a struggle between the democratic powers of the West, the Western Hemisphere, and that was dominated by the USA, but essentially all their friends in one democratic gang, versus on the Eastern side, on the Eastern Hemisphere, a communist bloc of countries, again, a big gang of communist countries dominated by the USSR, and that stands for Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and it's what Russia was known as between 1922 and 1991. And this term, the Cold War, is popularized by this American journalist from 1947 onwards to basically just depict this time of great tension. It's a frosty relationship. It's a Cold War. It's not necessarily all out, military war. It is a time period that is characterized by propaganda, each side producing really evil depictions of the other. It's characterized by espionage and spying. The possibility of nuclear war is absolutely something that we need to discuss today. It's not just a military race, but it is a space race. Who can put the first man in space, man on the moon? All that is part of the Cold War. It's definitely an arms race, though. The how many nuclear weapons can you build? Who can have the biggest nuclear weapon? Whose nuclear weapon can travel the furthest? All of that is part of the Cold War. Importantly for our study at A-level, proxy wars is a big part of the Cold War, and a proxy war is basically where two sides within a country or two countries fight each other with support from either side. basically the USA and the USSR were fighting each other through their client states. So one of our biggest case studies at A level is the study of the Vietnam War, and there we have North Vietnam as a client state being supported by the USSR, and we have South Vietnam as the client state being supported by the USA. So that is a proxy war. Finally, we've got dollar imperialism. This term obviously is sort of aimed at America, but the USSR did this sort of thing as well. Essentially, both sides used financial aid to buy themselves friends. Obviously, imperialism is a term that we associate with empire, and the days of empire are dying out by this point. People weren't buying themselves colonies, but they were certainly buying themselves friends. And so essentially the entire world was caught up in the Cold War. You didn't have to be America or the USSR. Every country pretty much signed themselves up to one of these great big teams. And it was a real ideological struggle. We've got in that third bullet point, democratic versus communist. And when you've had a chance to have a look at that YouTube clip, we're then going to talk a little bit more about the politics. We need to have a basic understanding of politics in order to understand the Cold War. So here we have the political spectrum. Apologies to those of you who have a great understanding of politics already, but we're just going to do a few basics here. As I said, it's really crucial for understanding the Cold War. Some of you might even be thinking of taking politics A-level as well, and it is a really great combination, especially when we look at our Year 13 course. In Year 12, you'll study the Cold War and the Tudors, but in Year 13, you'll study American history from 1865 onwards. And actually, if you have a good understanding of how American politics works, it's really useful for that part of the course as well. But anyway, here we have the political spectrum, left wing to right wing, and the UK would be very much in the centre today. We have elements of socialism in this country, but we also have elements of conservatism as well. So let's just go through a few basics on each side. Let's go to the left wing. So the communist ideology originates from an economist, a philosopher known as Karl Marx. And he, in the 1800s, wrote a couple of books, the Communist Manifesto, Das Kapital. His theory was that eventually the working classes would become so oppressed, they would be so fed up by being exploited by those above them, that they would naturally rise up in a revolution and seize the means of control within a country. And in a communist country, everything is controlled by the state, because actually what they theorize is that it's not about the individual, it's about the good of society. It's very utopian, really. It doesn't work in practice. And in fact, there has not been a single country in this world that has been purely communist. Every single communist revolution has not been led by the masses. It has been led by a small, militant, middle class intelligentsia generally rising up and enforcing communism, I suppose. So it's never happened naturally, and perhaps that's why, one of the reasons why communism hasn't generally worked in this world. The other thing is that if we take some of those utopian principles of communism, things like equal wages, no matter what job you earn in a communist country, no matter what job you have in a communist country, you all earn exactly the same wage. And then generally that just doesn't work in practice. I always like to compare it to the equivalent of saying, you've just done your FGAs. No matter how hard you work in those FGAs, you will get exactly the same grade. Nobody would bother working, because if you worked really hard, you'd get a grade 5. And if you did absolutely no work at all, you'd still get a grade 5. And that's generally what's happened in communist countries. People aren't motivated to work, so the economy starts to struggle. If we take one of the examples that we look at in our course, North Korea, in the 1990s, they went through a huge famine. And even today, there has been a statement put out recently that indicates a bit of concern about what's happening in North Korea, which is very strange for them because, of course, they're one of the most well, they are the most strictly controlled country in the world. So for them to say something negative about themselves is quite unusual. So what have we said about communism so far? Everyone's equal. You know, there are some great features of it. There's generally no unemployment, no homelessness. Everything is controlled by the state, so it's awarded according to need. As I said, it just generally doesn't work in practice because people need something to motivate them. Now, on the other side then of the spectrum, we have fascism. So some of the examples that we've had in the 20th century would be Mussolini's Italy or Nazi Germany. And that is all about individualism. There are some things in common, actually, and some political theorists speculate that rather than a linear spectrum like this, that actually it should be more of a horseshoe shape, because actually there are features of communism and fascism that are very similar. We often get dictators. As you can see at the top, we've got dictatorship on both sides. But is the complete opposite about that then? The opportunity to make wealth, about the individual prospering. As I said, the UK is kind of in the middle because, of course, we do have some features of the right. We have private ownership of property and businesses, but then we have some things that are a bit leftist. Like, for example, we have an NHS, which is free at point of access, and our education is free at point of access as well. We pay through it for our taxes, but ultimately it's free when you use it. So we're kind of in the middle there. Now, essentially, America during the Cold War is absolutely petrified of communism. They go through, in the early 1950s, something called a Red Scare, where they are arresting anybody who is, who they speculate is probably a communist. It's not only the 1950s where they have a Red Scare. There's one in the 1920s as well. If you wanted to look up a little bit about Satcher and Vanzetti, that is a very disturbing case which proves just how fearful America is of communism. But essentially this theory of how a country should operate absolutely terrifies America. And it's because actually when we think about the American dream, it is the complete antithesis of communism. The American dream is all about individuals prospering, no matter who you are, no matter what you start off as in life. If you work hard, you can achieve great things. And so actually control of the means of production by the state, by the masses, is something that completely stands at odds with how America see a country as being run ideally. And it actually starts to escalate, not so much 30s and 40s, there's big distractions, but in the aftermath of the Second World War, this fear of communism escalates because of what actually happened in the 20th century. So just to run you through a brief history of communism, the very first communist country in the world was Russia. They went through in 1917 two revolutions. Obviously, that's towards the end of the First World War, and that's a big catalyst for these revolutions. In February, a revolution took place that overthrew the royal family. They were forced to abdicate. They went into exile and they were assassinated the next year. The assassination of the Romanovs is a very famous tale, and the scene of the crime is depicted in that top right-hand corner. The second revolution took place in October that year, and that was the Communist Revolution. The Bolshevik Party, led by Vladimir Lenin, who is pictured up in the top left-hand corner, with his right-hand man stood just to the side of that podium, Leon Trotsky. They seized power in October 1917. Not everybody was happy about that, and they had to fight a 3-year civil war. The Reds being associated the colour of communism versus the Whites, who were the supporters of the old monarchy. And actually a lot of European countries sent troops to support the Whites because, Britain did. Our royal family was terrified that actually another royal family could be overthrown and assassinated. And actually our royal family were related to the Russian royal family. They were cousins, and it's all Queen Victoria marrying her children into different royal families in Europe. Ultimately, the Reds, the communists, were successful in that civil war, and in 1922 the USSR was set up. So this starts that fear of communism spreading, the fact that the very first communist country had been set up. But what they actually did was set up something called the Comintern, the Communist International, to try and spread communism around the world. Initially, it's a slow start. Communist countries spring up in communist parties spring up in in countries around Europe and around the world, actually. But because of the distraction of the Second World War, nothing much happens until 1949. In 1949, China turned communist. That's the second communist country. And that sparks that Red Scare in America, this fear of communism. Remember that America is a capitalist country. They believe in private ownership of wealth, private ownership of goods and services. And actually, they are more to the right wing than we are. They believe in very minimalist government intervention. And the big fear was that, we use a term, the domino theory at A level, like a row of dominoes, countries would fall one by one to communism. The big fear was that the American dream would be destroyed if communism was to spread to America. And if we go back to that definition of the Cold War from the one of the earlier slides, I mentioned that this was characterized by propaganda. And here's a great example of the sort of propaganda that America was producing. You've got at the bottom, little old Uncle Sam representing America there, stood with his hands like, what are we going to do? The USSR, this great big aggressive bear, drooling all over the world. So the USSR spreading their influence. For our side of the course, at A level, we look at China, we look at Vietnam. But you can see here, I mentioned, the Cold War is a global conflict. So Afghanistan absolutely has a huge part to play in the later part of the Cold War. The USSR invaded Afghanistan in 1979. Of course, the influence of that is still felt to this day. The Gulf War, I was a child when the Gulf War was taking place, but I was living in Cyprus, and I distinctly remember, the early 1990s, this great tension in that part of the world. Africa was a big part of the Cold War as well. Lots of communist countries springing up there. But Western Europe is depicted here. And you've also got, just sneaking in the edge there, Cuba. And those are the two places that I'd like to really talk about today, because, as I said at the very beginning, there are some big parts of the Cold War that we actually have to skim over because we focus on the Cold War in Asia, but actually there are some huge events taking place in Western Europe and over in Cuba in the Western Hemisphere that actually have a big influence on the decisions that America takes in Asia, but we just don't have time to talk about in the course. So the first thing we're going to take a look at is Western Europe. So here is Germany at the end of the Second World War. And we're going to talk a little bit about what actually happens to Germany. So they surrendered not long after Hitler's suicide. They surrendered on the 8th of May 1945, and that's of course now VE Day. They surrendered to the Allies, and that's who was in control of Germany at the end of the Second World War. So this map shows how they were divided up into 4 occupation zones, one for each of the 4 main allies. So the red section was controlled by the USSR, the yellow section was controlled by the USA, the blue section was controlled by France, and we had the green section. And that was essentially a bit like a trusteeship where those 4 countries would run Germany while they figured out what to do with it, because of course they didn't have a government. They needed to re-establish this country basically from scratch. How were we going to run it basically after the Second World War? There's one final thing that we need to point out, really importantly, for our first main event in the Cold War. And that's what happened to Berlin. You can see in the middle of the red zone, there's a little splodge of colour, and that's Berlin, the capital of Germany. Now, because the capital was so deep inside USSR territory, it was decided that each of the 4 allies would have a small section of Berlin. So it's divided up exactly the same. And Berlin is the focus of the very first, or one of the first main events in the Cold War. Now, the Berlin blockade is the first real test of the relationship between the USA and the USSR. Again, so I'm not just talking at you, you've got a couple of bits of information to go through here. First of all, there is a very brief story of the Berlin blockade that took place from 1948 into 1949, and you've also got a YouTube link at the top to have a look at some footage of what actually happened during the blockade. So what I'd like you to do is pause this PowerPoint, have a look at the clip, have a read through the story, and then I'll come back and pull out a little bit about why this was such a crisis. So this Berlin blockade lasts for an entire year. You can see in the top left-hand corner the aerial drops that were absolutely crucial to the people who were living inside Berlin for their survival. Everything that they needed to survive had to be airlifted in. There was no other way. And the airlift is the thing that causes the tension. So let's take a look at this propaganda poster. We've got another political cartoon here in the bottom right-hand corner. It is very obviously an Allied poster. I don't know whether it was produced by Britain or America, but it's very clearly one of that team's works. You can tell that by how Berlin is depicted. If you look at the bottom of the poster, Stalin is dividing up Berlin into East versus West. If we look at Western Berlin, where Britain and France and America had their zones, Berlin has been rebuilt. They, as a trio, wanted to rejuvenate Germany. They wanted to rebuild it. They didn't want to repeat the mistakes of the Treaty of Versailles in the First World War, which ultimately led to a Second World War. So the buildings have rebuilt and Berlin is thriving. On the east, where we have communism, you can see actually the buildings are still fallen down, and there's absolutely no sign of recovery in the aftermath of the Second World War. And that's really what Stalin wanted to do. The USSR, of all countries, suffered the most during the Second World War. Their casualties are up to about 20 million. That's partly due to the policies of their own government, but also due to the hardships of war. And they really wanted to punish Germany, and they didn't want to rebuild in the aftermath of the Second World War, and that's represented in this poster here. But that negative representation of Stalin and the aftermath of the Second World War tells us that this is an Allied poster. Again, we can tell because if we look at Stalin, he is acting as the aggressor. He is holding that gun. He is the one pointing at the sky. And this is the real source of tension. No one really knew what would happen when the first airlift was carried out. No one knew if he would shoot down those planes. So it really was the test. And ultimately, he did not shoot any down. There were a number of deaths, but that was just due to the sheer number of planes flying out of that airbase that you could actually see in the previous map. The final clue that tells us that this is an Allied poster is, of course, the birds at the top. Storks are, in that classic tale of where babies come from, the deliverers of life. And here they are again, using the stork as an image to represent the delivery of life. Coal, food, more food, all coal and food are those bags that the storks are carrying. And that positive representation of the airlift again tells us that this is an Allied cartoon. So here it is, the very first test of the USA versus the USSR during the Cold War. No one really knew whether Stalin would shoot down those planes and perhaps start another war, but ultimately he chose not to, and that's probably because of where we were at in the arms race at this point. In 1949, at the end of the Berlin blockade, America was still the only nuclear power in the world. The USSR tested their first successful nuclear detonation in the winter of that year. So had this Berlin blockade taken a little bit later, we don't know what would have happened. But at this point, the USA was the only nuclear power, and that probably swung it in their favour. Now, by our second event, they are not the only nuclear power, and that means that the Cuban Missile Crisis is probably the closest that we've come to nuclear war in our history. So let's talk a little bit about Cuba. Here it is on the map, coloured in red. Geography is really important here. It's really important to note that Cuba is just 90 miles from that southernmost tip of Florida. Geography, as I said, plays a really important part in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Previously, these countries had a really positive relationship. Cuba had been the destination of choice for Americans because of its glorious beaches, its rum, its cigars. They had a strong trading relationship. Lots of Americans owned businesses, sugar plantations, for example, in Cuba. And so actually, there is loads and loads of American influence still today in Cuba. Of course, the classic American cars can still be seen. But all of this came to an end in 1959. Following a 3-year civil war, Fidel Castro and his right-hand man, Che Guevara, took control of Cuba, set up a communist government, and overnight that relationship ended. American businesses lost their property overnight. And this is America's fear come true, that communism was spreading and it was now right on their doorstep. Now, the USSR was really keen to forge a relationship with Cuba because they were the only communist country in the Western Hemisphere at this point. And so it was something that they were really keen to invest in. And pretty much immediately, the USSR started trading with Cuba, but they were, most importantly for us, trading or providing them with nuclear weapons. I mentioned again in that earlier slide that the Cold War is characterized by espionage. And here we have one of the examples that the U-2 spy planes produced. This photograph is apparently an MRBM launch site. To the untrained eye, looks like nothing to me, but apparently this is clear photographic evidence that nuclear weapons were being built up. You can have a look at the clip now, take a pause and listen to somebody else talking, and that tells you about the build-up in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, the big fear is about where these weapons are because, as I mentioned before, the USSR had had nuclear weapons since the end of 1949. So it's not that they have them, it's about where they are. So if we look at this infographic here, ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, contributed to something called mutually assured destruction, which is a good thing, believe it or not. Essentially, if you take a look at the US missiles that are on USA territory, they are able to reach the USSR, and that journey takes about 30 minutes. And basically what happens in that 30 minutes is that the USSR's technology detects those nuclear warheads in the Earth's atmosphere, and they would realize that they were being attacked and they would launch their own weapons back. And so what we would have is mutually assured destruction. And that basically meant that nobody would be prepared to go to nuclear war because if you fired your nuclear weapons, you were guaranteed to have nuclear weapons fired back at you, and you wouldn't do that. That would be madness. So the positioning of the weapons is important. Now, if we think about Cuba's position, remember I said geography is important, just 90 miles from the southernmost tip of Florida, those nuclear weapons are much closer to American soil. And so the problem here is that America would not have the time to recognize that they had been fired upon and fire their own back. Mutually assured destruction no longer exists, and what we have is a massive problem for America. Again, political cartoon representing this struggle. Now, here we've got the two leaders of these two countries at the time. On the left from the USSR, we've got Khrushchev, and on the right, we've got President Kennedy, both with their fingers on the triggers, representing just how tense this Cuban Missile Crisis actually was. And we want to get into why it was so tense now, why this is the closest that we've ever come to nuclear war. It was very much a war of words, and that's represented in the next slide by President Kennedy's speech. Now, if you want to take a look at the wording for a moment, you pause that and read that. You could open the clip if you wanted. If you wanted to hear Kennedy speaking, the entire thing is 17 minutes. I've just taken out what I think is one of the most important sections. I'll just give you a moment to read that and then we can resume. So Kennedy does a few really important things here. First of all, in the fourth line, he stresses that this is an explicit threat to the peace and security of all the Americas. So it's not just America, not just the USA, it's all of the Americas that are threatened by these weapons. He brings in other countries. He mentions that this is deliberate defiance of the Rio Pact of 1947. So he stresses that the USSR are breaking this pact by putting their nuclear weapons on Cuba. He also stresses that actually it's the USSR that are the aggressors here, and that America was only responding to Soviet aggression. Now, that speech takes place on the 22nd of October, and here is where that fits in. You've got a little timeline here of the events of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Again, if you just want to take a look at that, just pause the PowerPoint, have a read through the timeline yourself, and then I'll talk about the two red arrows here. Right, these red arrows are what I would consider to be the two crucial moments, the two most tense moments where nuclear war could have broken out. So if we take a look at the first one, this is to do with the blockade. Kennedy had several options for how to respond when he found out that the nuclear weapons were being built up on Cuba. Some of his advisors pushed for a more aggressive stance. What he decided to do was quite diplomatic and carry out a blockade. So essentially surrounding the island of Cuba with naval ships. Don't allow anything in, don't allow anything out. The first real test in this crisis then came as Soviet ships were steaming towards American ships, and nobody knew what would happen. It was again a bit like Stalin's test in the Berlin blockade. Nobody knew whether Stalin would shoot down those aeroplanes. Nobody knew whether the Americans would have to fire on the Soviet ships. This really was, this strength of will that we see depicted in that previous cartoon with Kennedy and Khrushchev arm wrestling. As it happened, nobody had to fire. At the very last moment, the USSR turned their ships around and the USSR actually backed down. But this is crisis point number 1 in the Cuban Missile Crisis. What happens after that is we get a series of letters going back and forth between JFK and Khrushchev. And the second crisis comes on Saturday the 27th of October, when Khrushchev sent his second letter with the terms in which he would be prepared to remove the nuclear weapons from Cuba. His first letter had said just end the blockade and I'll remove the weapons. His second letter escalated those demands and said that he would only remove his nuclear weapons from Cuba if America removed their nuclear weapons from Turkey, which were obviously very close to the USSR. Again, that was a real test of wills. What was going to happen? Who was going to back down first? Kennedy again played a very diplomatic move and replied to the first letter in public, replied to the second letter very secretly. So actually, for all that this is the closest we've ever come to nuclear war, this whole thing ends with letters being sent and diplomatic means. But it really was the absolute moment where people at the time really considered that a nuclear war could break out. And we're going to finish on that theme. The threat of nuclear war was all around people. And we can really, there's no better evidence that the threat was everywhere than this clip, this information ad that was actually aimed at children. And my mother remembers this. She was born in 1957, so she was about 5 years old during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and she distinctly remembers having nuclear alarm drills at school where the fire alarm would go off and they would have to hide under their desks. Like that would protect them from nuclear war. But you can see that in this classic example here. We do love this in the history department. Bert the turtle and duck and cover. And this is how I would like to end our presentation of the Cold War in Europe. You can pause this in a moment and bring up that YouTube link and have a good laugh at the advice that was given to kids back in the 1960s. It really was quite shocking, but again, real great evidence that there was a huge amount of tension during this time. So thank you very much, Year 11, for listening to me drone on about the Cold War in Europe today. As I said, I think those are two really crucial events that have a massive impact on the Cold War. And really dictate how America runs their foreign policy, the decisions that they make that do ultimately not have a knock-on effect in Asia, but we just never get round to talking about when we are studying A-level. If you do have any questions about the A-level course, then of course get in touch. If it's specifically about the Cold War, one of us. If it's specifically about the Tudors, Mr. Richards or Miss Townsend or Mrs. Wood are your best people to chat to there. But we do hope to see as many of you as possible in September. In the meantime, enjoy your summer. You have worked so hard recently. We are so proud of you we want you to take a really well-earned break and see you fresh and rejuvenated, ready for some great history in September. Thanks again, Year 11. See you later.